Certainly don't take this as like a, example of what you should do. This is just some grimy old batteries that I scabbed together on a pallet here just for the or just for the purpose of fucking around with it and learning and what have you. But I made a video the other day about the parallel sets of batteries becoming unbalanced in a 24 volt setup like this. And so in that one video, I was talking about adding these parallel jumpers in this setup. And since then, I've added some strips of copper flat bar for the series connection on the center row there. And I was reasonably happy with the way that turned out. It's, much lower profile and neater and, maybe is more conductive. I would imagine just having one solid chunk of copper versus, two lugs and wire. Anyways, last video I was talking about, for one, the parallel sets becoming out of balance, which has since been resolved adding these parallel jumpers, but also each bank of the batteries here, like say that row there or that row there, becoming unbalanced, and not terribly, but just a little bit. And since then, I bought this little gizmo here, and it's a battery equalizer. Jesus Christ, words are hard. And so it's got 3 wires that comes off the back of it here. One goes to the total bank negative, the other to the bank positive, and then one on the center for the series connection. And from that, it can distinguish what each bank is, which is really neat. And in the case of this one, has little voltmeters on it, which I think is slicker than shit. But there's 2 different ways that these things can work. There can either be a and I don't quote me on what the terminology would be here, but like a passive or an active battery balancer. A passive one, if we're going to go with that terminology, will drain down the high side bank to bring it in line with the lower bank. A active one, which evidently this one here is, will actually take power from the high bank and put it into the low bank. And then that way it's much more efficient. This thing was like fucking 20 some dollars on eBay. I don't remember exactly how much it was. It was extremely cheap. It just absolutely blows me away how insanely cheap electronics are getting nowadays, and for that matter, how good they are. I had originally assumed that this thing was a passive balancer, one that would bleed off the higher bank just based on how cheap it was. And so I had hooked this thing up, and I actually didn't realize that it had the voltmeter on it at first. The pictures look different than this one, and so I kind of thought that I got screwed on it, and I had it facing down, and I had hooked it up, and I was feeling the back side of it to see if it was getting warm. And I was actually rather pissed off that it wasn't getting warm, because assuming that it is an active balancer, assuming that it's a passive balancer, it would have to be getting warm. And okay, it's 10 degrees, but was that because I was touching it? It's 10 degrees warmer, but that could very well be because I was touching it. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that it is in fact an active balancer. And the way that I could tell that was I had disconnected every single one of these batteries for a different reason. And I was going through and I was checking all the individual battery voltages. And so I knew off the top of my head what each one of the battery voltages was. And then I had this little gizmo hooked up, and I was using a DC power supply to equalize this rack of batteries here, and then I was going to switch to the rear, and then I noticed that the voltages jumped up on the rear set, and I was like, holy shit, little bastard's actually working. And so the way this is configured at the moment, the numbers on the right are the front bank here, the ones closest, and the number on the left is the rear bank. And if I turn up the DC power supply here, we can see that in fact the voltage is rising on the rear bank. And so I want to equalize the rear bank. And so what I'm going to do is, I believe, set this to 14.6 and let it soak up some power there for a while. Like, wait until the amperage comes down to 1.5 amps, 2 amps or something like that, and then I'll equalize it. But actually, even look at that. The voltage on the front bank is already starting to come up. So I'll give it an hour or so, and, well, half an hour. I'll give it some time and we'll come back. Okay, but that didn't take long at all. Has already brought the front side bank up to 13.5. And I actually don't know how long it was, but just 3.5 amps charging into the back bank at the moment. I went and looked up the eBay purchase for this, and it was $28. And it says that it's a 5 amp equalizer, which it's not. I've got my amp clamp hooked up there, and this is like the designation is millivolts, but what it's reading is the amperage. The amp clamp registers in millivolts, if that's the correct terminology for it. Anyways, we got roughly 1 amp coming out of the rear bank and 0.7 amp going into the front bank. And I don't know. So that probably means that 0.3 amps is being turned into heat inside of it. And so I wouldn't, because of sticker on the front, these things here seem to be a little bit weird on shiny surfaces. So, I don't know. It's a couple degrees warmer, so I suppose that makes sense. The other thing then that I was curious about was how accurate this fucking camera was, how accurate the voltmeter is. So I've got the Fluke hooked up to the front bank here. Fluke saying 13.46, and the little equalizer is saying 13.5, and I'd say that's a fair deal there. And then the rear bank on the Fluke, 14.34, 14.3 on the equalizer. So I would say that's pretty darn good. Now, I could hook up this wire to run through the amperage port on the multimeter and get a much more accurate reading, but I just simply don't feel like unhooking that wire. I'm just very impressed at how well, a $30 little black box from China works for this shit. Maybe it's just a matter of I'm a lot older than I care to admit or whatever, but it wasn't that long ago that Chinese electronics were absolute total fucking dog shit. And like they wouldn't even, work the first time you pulled them out of the box, and didn't even do the thing that they said they were going to do, which granted this says 5 amp and it's only running at 1 amp, but shit still works, very, very impressed to see that this little bastard is working that well. And I actually was so I want to do a couple more battery banks for a couple different applications, and I was almost kind of debating about not doing 24 volt because I was having issues with the banks being out of balance, or the racks of batteries being out of balance, and I was kind of worried about it. But seeing how well that little fart there works, maybe this is, and like, okay, I know Victron and, a whole bunch of other companies make equalizers, though to my knowledge, the Victron equalizer is a passive equalizer, like the way that it works is bleeding off energy, which in my application is not a big deal. If it bleeds off 5 amps or something like that, it's not the end of the world. But at the same time, it's like, you know, this thing here transfers energy from one battery to the other. So, you know, that's just a better deal all around, because you don't have the waste of the energy. In my situation, not a big deal, but maybe for some people, you know, the waste of 5 amps is a big deal. But yeah, I've only had this thing for, you know, hooked up to the batteries for a couple hours now, but I'm already very, very impressed at how well this is working. And I'll probably get another one, put it on another battery bank that I have, and make an update video later on.